First of all, thank you for delaying your dinner and attending the Azure roadmap, Azure migration roadmap and best practice session. My name is Nathan Mugley, and I'm a program manager in the Azure product group. I'm a recent addition to Azure. I joined about 4 months ago. Previous to that, I spent about 4 years in Exchange Online, working on the hosted mailbox service for storage, high availability, and also the Jet database engine, which lives in Exchange. And before that, I spent 8 years in the Active Directory product group. So that's my history.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gaurav Daga. I'm a program manager on the availability services group in Microsoft Azure. Specifically, we work on the Azure Site Recovery Service, which focuses on migration, disaster recovery, dev test, and many other scenarios. Today, of course, we're here to talk about migration to Azure. So I'll be co-presenting with Nathan and walking you through some demos.
So before we dive into all things Azure migration, I first wanted to say that we're really excited to do this presentation because we have some announcements we are going to be making during this session for upcoming product functionality, which we have not yet ever discussed before this session with the public. So hopefully you share our excitement on the things we'll be announcing. I also want to kind of level set by what it means when I say Azure migration. Migration is one of those kind of squishy topics where it can mean a lot of different things to different people. It's kind of nuanced. I created this diagram in the top right as kind of a mental model for how I think about this session. In terms of migration, there's your migration scenario, whatever it is that you need to do for whatever business reasons to migrate, and you have your own intricacies and nuances. And then there's the corpus of Azure services out there, and each one of the 48 Azure services can all interpret migration in a little bit differently. Some Azure services are so new that migration hasn't come up as a topic before. Others, like storage and compute, which we'll be going into, have much more maturity in the area of migration. And then lastly, there's the set of migration tools we use to facilitate all these scenarios. Today's session is very tool-based. And so we're going to be talking about different Azure migration scenarios through the lens of tools that are available today. And at the end of the session, we'll talk about a roadmap on how we are investing in improving the tools. And the reason that we were kind of so focused on the tools is because I wanted to make this a little bit more of a real-world session, things that you can go back to your organization and try, and not just some academic discussion on migration. So we kind of focused our efforts on 3 migration scenarios that we'll be covering today. The first is virtual or physical machine to Azure. Second is AWS, virtual machine to Azure. And you'll notice a trend here that the last thing is always Azure. And then lastly, a scenario which I don't think we've talked to customers about in a forum like this, which is Azure to Azure, which is a new scenario for us. So we chose these scenarios because we hear from customers that these are ones that they commonly face day to day. They're also ones that we have a story to tell around in terms of tooling and migration. So I'm going to hand this off to Gaurav, who's going to cover the first 2. Oops. There's your clicker.
Thank you, Nathan. All right, so let's start with on-premises to Azure migration and AWS to Azure migrations. We'll start off with some context. Here's what, as we research the whole migration topic and availability in general, what we've been hearing from our customers is that managing IT infrastructure is really complex, it's expensive, and it's also error-prone. Right? There are different situations that a business encounters where they need to have elasticity, scalability, flexibility in their IT environment. And so what we're talking about today is under this umbrella called availability on demand. This is the set of Microsoft Azure availability services. And what these help you do is solve your IT challenges with the hyperscale that Microsoft Azure provides, right? So you can, if necessary, extend your data center when you need to. You can achieve true hybrid cloud, right, where you run stuff on premises when you want to, migrate it to Azure when you want to, bring it back on premises when you want to. So give you complete flexibility in managing your infrastructure with minimal capital expenditure. And then, of course, transform your business. As we all know, Satya talked about it at the keynote. Several of our leaders talked about it. This is a transformational time. All IT departments are evaluating the public cloud. So availability on demand allows you to sort of take baby steps and check out the public cloud, in this case, Microsoft Azure. And as you get more comfortable, realize the potential, you can move more and more of your production into Azure. Now, there are two Microsoft Azure services that encompass the availability on demand umbrella. One of them is called Microsoft Azure Backup, and then the other is called Microsoft Azure Site Recovery. Just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of either of these services? Okay, so that's a fairly large number, so that's great. So, it's good that you know about the backup and site recovery services that Microsoft offers. Now, one thing that you may not have heard about is the various scenarios that these two services that combine the availability on demand umbrella help you solve, right? Of course, backup and long-term retention are fairly commonplace. Every virtual machine, every server that you have in your IT department has a backup plan, gets backed up, and you potentially, are using tapes today, and our goal is that, we replace tapes and modernize your data center with having you, do long-term retention in the public cloud, right? So those are fairly common, well-known scenarios. The other one that you all obviously know about, given the show of hands, is disaster recovery, right? So Azure Site Recovery has traditionally been pitched only as a disaster recovery service. But today, what we are announcing, and through the course of the Ignite conference, we have multiple sessions where we're starting to talk about this entire availability on demand usage, where Azure Site Recovery not only helps you with your disaster recovery needs, be it you want to use Azure as your disaster recovery site or your own secondary data center as your disaster recovery site. Also, we're talking about migration. Migration to Azure is sort of a subset scenario for disaster recovery, right? You replicate to Azure and you test your application and cut over to Azure, as opposed to replicate and stay with a DR insurance. And then there are a few other scenarios that we're talking about. Dev test is one of them. Dev test is very, very interesting because, again, almost all of us have scenarios like Patch Tuesday where you need to validate your production servers are getting the right patches before you can actually deploy them really in production, right? And then the other two that you see on this slide, which are more niche as of today, but we see them growing over time, are cloud bursting, where you can scale up your environment into Azure as you need to, and analytics and reporting, where you don't want to impact your production when you want to run some deep analysis. Instead, you can take copies, run them in Azure, run your analysis there, and discard those copies when you need to. So this is sort of the whole availability on demand suite of things. Of course, today's session is all about migration to Azure, so we're going to be focusing on that pivot and talking a lot about that. All right. Why migrate workloads to Azure? Again, it's one of those things where in your journey to modernize your data center, you're looking to reduce your IT expenditure. You're looking to have this true hybrid experience where when there is need, you can actually run things in Azure. And of course, with Azure Site Recovery, you get a reliable and scalable solution that works for all your applications, be it Tier 1 workloads or Tier 2 workloads. And finally, the last point is you get this, I keep repeating, hyperscale, right, that Azure offers. Azure is available in multiple different countries today. It's got a very large data center footprint. Nathan will be talking about some of those in detail later in the talk. But the availability of Azure and the scale makes it a really attractive option to run your production workloads. So key considerations for any migration solution. In this case, we're talking migration to Azure. You want to absolutely avoid any sort of downtime when it comes to migration, right? You have users who are connecting to your business applications every day. You don't want them to be impacted while you're planning or executing your migration. Of course, you want to test your applications on Azure before you migrate them. There is no such thing as migration without any planning or testing, right? It is a fairly planned activity. You want to make sure that your networking semantics, your storage semantics, everything else, performance characteristics, all of them are validated before you can actually migrate and cut over your app to run in Azure. And of course, one of the other premises that availability on demand or Azure Site Recovery provides is you now have the ability to replicate your data once and use it for multiple purposes. If you choose to migrate to Azure, that's great. If you choose to stay in Azure purely for disaster recovery reasons, where you fail over if there is a disaster, or when there is an audit where you have to show that you have a disaster recovery plan, then that's fine too. You can use the same replicated copy for test, cloud analytics, any of those scenarios that we talked about. So that's a really powerful story that we're actually announcing and starting to talk about at Ignite today. All right, so here's sort of the scenario slide that covers the various scenarios that we're talking about today in this migration roadmap. Of course, on the primary site, you could be running Hyper-V workloads or VMware workloads, which are the first two pictures left to right. Now, Hyper-V to Azure has been something that is available with Azure Site Recovery now for a few months. It's a generally available service. It's been there probably for 6 months now. And if you want today, you can take your Hyper-V servers, install a simple agent, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, replicate those workloads that are sitting on top of that Hyper-V server into Azure right now. And that's completely seamless and generally available. No real tools to be installed, because the replication technology, which is called Hyper-V Replica, is available natively in Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. Now, what I'm really excited about announcing today, and what we'll be deep diving into, is the two things that are saying, new. One is the ability to take your VMware workloads on premises and migrate them into Azure. And the second is the ability to take physical bare metal servers or AWS VMs or Azure VMs and do migrations into Azure. In the case of Azure VMs, we're talking about cross-region migrations. So you're the first public audience where we are discussing this, and we're really excited to be talking to you and demonstrating these capabilities. So let's get into the details. So for migrating VMware VMs and physical servers, this is our architecture diagram that you're going to see here. Let's start left to right. So if you're customer one and you have a bunch of sources, be it VMware VMs or physical machines, the first thing you need is something on those servers that is able to replicate data to Azure, that's able to send data to Azure so that you have a copy of your production workloads running in Azure. So for that, we introduce a component called the mobility service. The mobility service is an in-guest lightweight agent that is sitting inside your guest virtual machine or physical machine and capturing all the writes in memory and replicating them to Azure, right? So the key point is, once you have some amount of replication done for your what we call initial replication, the mobility service works based on deltas. So as there are changes, it captures those deltas and sends them off, right? So there's really the initial replication time is the one that depends on the size of your server. For example, if you have a large, say, multiple terabyte server, and of course a factor of the bandwidth that you have in your connectivity to Azure. Now, you don't want to send all of this data as is from all these servers uncompressed, without any caching, without any encryption and such, right? So we introduced this second component that is called the process server. The process server acts as your migration gateway, right? It's sitting on your on-premise data center. It's a Windows Server 2012 R2 virtual machine or physical machine. And this is the server that's doing all the heavy lifting. It's the one that's doing the caching. It's the one that's doing the compression and the encryption. Now, what this ensures is that the mobility service, which is sitting on each of your guest virtual machines or physical machines, is truly lightweight. There is nothing that it really has to do other than capturing all the writes, all the changes that are going on, and sending it to the process server. It's the process server that does all the hard work in ensuring that your bandwidth is optimized, your data is secure, and so on. This ensures that there is really minimal to no impact on your production workloads, which is one of the key tenets that we talked about in one of the previous slides. So you wouldn't see any CPU impact, any I/O impact or such because of the fact that you're running an agent inside your production servers. Now let's move to the right. You have your Microsoft Azure subscription, which is what the little blue rectangle is showing. The first component in there is what we call the master target server. The master target server is the replication receiver. So whatever the process server is sending, we need somebody to actually capture those and save those off in Azure for use when you're actually going to do your test and your final cutover. Now, one of the important points to note here is that there are several migration products that are out there that work on what is called an active replication model. So they require you to have an active running virtual machine in Azure while you're actually doing your replication. And again, the example that I talked about earlier, say you have a multi-terabyte server, and that takes, let's say, a week to seed. You're going to have that entire duration with your actual running virtual machine capturing all the replicated data. In our case, we don't require any active-active solution. We are a cold standby active-passive replication solution. So essentially, we are writing things to VHDs. Whatever changes that are coming from your source are being written to VHDs that are attached to the master target server. And only when you issue a migration, maybe for a test or for an actual cutover, that's when we spin off actual virtual machines using those VHDs. So you really don't need to have running VMs. All you need is these master target servers depending on your scale. And the source volumes are being replicated to these on the VHDs that are running on these master target server. So another point on the master target is that since we are an operating system agnostic technology, we work with Windows, we work with Linux, any sources, we replicate all of them. You need a Windows master target for all your Windows sources, and you need a Linux master target for all your Linux sources. And when we come to the demonstration, I'll show you how easy it is to deploy and manage these Linux master target or Windows master target VMs. So the final component in this picture is what is called a configuration server. Again, the config server runs inside your Azure subscription. This is the central management head. Now you have all these entities, the process server, the agents, which are called the mobility service, and the master target. All of these register with your configuration server, and the config server is the VM that is doing all the orchestration and management of this entire migration, right? And lastly, you have Azure. We give you a single user interface with Azure Site Recovery. That becomes your UI where you drive this entire migration procedure. So if you have another customer, that comes in, of course, your failed over VMs run inside your subscription, right? That's the set of servers that you see inside your subscriptions. So whenever you issue a migration cutover, those VMs are going to run inside your Azure subscription. Same picture when there is a second customer, you'll have that customer will need to deploy a process server, which will in turn, deploy the mobility service. And on their Azure subscription, they'll have a config server and a master target, or multiple of these, depending on their scale. Okay, so salient features or salient points of migration with ASR. Before I go here, one question again. How many of you have seen or heard of this other service that we had called Microsoft Migration Accelerator? Again, show of hands. Okay, there's fewer than who have heard of ASR. So Microsoft Migration Accelerator was a service we launched in fall of 2014. The goal was, it was a very limited private preview so that we can have migrations started off. But today, with the whole availability on demand announcement that we're doing with Azure Site Recovery, Microsoft Migration Accelerator service has been shut down because all the functionality has been folded into Azure Site Recovery, right? So no more new signups are being taken for a Migration Accelerator. Any customers who are in there have a few months grace period to finish their cutovers and complete their migrations. But all new migration requests are being redirected to Azure Site Recovery, which is also currently in public preview in sign-up mode. And we'll talk more about how you can get access and sign up and start testing your migrations as of today. So as we did this public preview of Azure Site Recovery to enable migrations of VMware VMs, physical servers, AWS, and Azure VMs, we incorporated a bunch of feedback that all the Migration Accelerator users gave us over the last few months. We have automated deployment of infrastructure components. Again, the next topic is our demonstration, so you'll see that. When I say infrastructure components, I mean all the Azure infrastructure servers, like the configuration servers and the master targets that you would need to deploy. Another key security improvement is Migration Accelerator required you to open inbound ports on your on-premises environment, so you either needed to use NATing or some other mechanism. With the Azure Site Recovery preview for migration, those requirements are completely gone. There is no need to open any inbound ports on your network firewall. You can basically, essentially, all the action is happening through outbound connectivity only, right? So that's an important enhancement. The next thing is the mobility service being a guest-based agent. We have worked on the ability to push the mobility service from the process server to the different source servers that you have, and we've fixed a bunch of issues that were there in that realm. Of course, if you have a large number of servers, say we're talking tens or hundreds, then there's always the ability to manually install the mobility service on all your source servers using your favorite software deployment technology, right? Be it Configuration Manager, System Center Config Manager, or whatnot. And then last point, very important, is a real consistent user experience with the Azure portal and the Azure Site Recovery experience. So you'll see this in the demonstration. Migration Accelerator was a separate UI. Now we have integrated everything into the familiar Azure interface. And of course, lots of security, scale, and quality improvements that come in the new Azure Site Recovery preview. So with that, let me switch over to the demonstration. So today I'm going to show you two things. I'm going to show you a SharePoint server that's running on VMware, migrated to Azure. And then secondly, an AWS Windows Army that's running in my AWS subscription, also migrated to Azure. So this is the scope for today, this demonstration. Of course, here's my SharePoint site. This is my Fabricam team site that's running on premises. And here's sort of the VMware environment where it's running. So you see I have a bunch of servers here. My SharePoint server is comprised of this web tier, this app tier, my database, SQL, which is right here, and then the Active Directory, right? So typical 4-server SharePoint deployment needing Active Directory, database, middle tier, and web tier. So let's first see how do I set up all of this for migration, all these components that we saw in the architecture diagram. Let's go and check out how we need to go and set all of this up, right? So first step with everything that you need to do with Azure Site Recovery for migrations or for any other scenario is you come into your Azure portal, go to Data Services, Recovery Services, Site Recovery Vault, and create what is called the Azure Site Recovery Vault. The Azure Site Recovery Vault, so let me first kick this off, is your billing entity. It is the place where all your stuff is associated, all your migration properties are stored here, right? So depending on how many servers you're looking to migrate, all that telemetry is all captured through this Azure Site Recovery Vault. And then the other key thing it lets you do is pick your region for migration, right? So for example, if I want to migrate into the Azure East US data center, I'll pick that and I'll say create vault, right? So this goes off and fires a job like everything Azure. You can go to the jobs pane and check the status on when it's done. Now, of course, I already have my vault that I'm going to use for the demo. So Fabricam is my vault here. I have a few, but I'm going to use Fabricam. So let's drill into it. And when we drill into it, you see this familiar Azure Quick Start experience that you probably see with every Azure service, right? So here, once you have an Azure Site Recovery Vault created, and you've subscribed to the new preview. So one thing to note is that the preview is not generally available. We'll show you the resources at the end of the deck where you can go and sign up for the preview, and it'll take a couple of weeks for you in the queue to get approved. But once you do, you'll see this new entry here that says set up recovery between an on-premises site with VMware physical servers and Azure. And this walks you through the steps that you need to do in order to set up your migration infrastructure, right? The first step is deploying a configuration server, which, as we discussed, is sort of the management head. Everybody registers to the configuration server. So in the sequence of operations, you deploy the configuration server first. Right? So you give the configuration server a name. You have to give it your username, the virtual machine's username, password. One other thing that you need to specify, and this is an offline step that you need to have done, is what network are you going to connect your configuration server to, right? So you want to have created your network, and we'll talk later that you can do this migration either over the internet, or if you are a Azure site-to-site VPN user or ExpressRoute user, you can use that too, right? So it's important when you're scoping your migration to decide which network you're going to put your stuff on. So in this case, I have existing networks, and then select a subnet and give it an IP address, right? So that's the first step. You set up your configuration server. So if I switch out here and go to servers, you'll see that I have my configuration server set up. Fabricam-CS is my configuration server. We'll come back to this. I mean, this is the server that's deployed. So what happens after you hit the deployment step is we go pick a gallery image that we have pre-created, an Azure IaaS gallery image that has the configuration server software installed, and go and create an instance of it for you. And then once that's done, it comes and shows up here. There are a couple of questions we ask you after you have deployed the configuration server, so you'll need to remote desktop into it and click through those. But once that's done, you're pretty much here, right? And then the next step, if you go back to Quick Start, is deploying your master target server. Now, the master target server, as we know now, is the replication receiver. It has two variants, one for Windows and one for Linux. So again, you give it a name. You select the operating system type, be it Windows or Linux. Select a VM size, right? So here we'll talk about sizing for this in one of the coming slides. But basically, in 90% of the cases, you're going to be picking the standard A4 size. The reason for the sizing option is that, depending on the number of disks that you have on your source servers. So Azure has different VM sizes, and it allows you to, specify what is the right number of disks that you need. So for example, a standard A4 supports up to 16 disks. A standard D14 supports up to 32 disks, right? So if you have a single source server that has more than 15 disks, then you'll need to use the standard D14. And again, I'll come back to this when we talk about sizing. And we have detailed documentation that covers all of this. But most cases, you'll pick standard A4. Again, everything else is the same. You specify username, password. You specify which configuration server you want to register this master target to, and it automatically picks the network, and you give it an IP address. So again, once this is done, it'll go, fire off a job. It'll pick the master target gallery image, deploy that for you, and register that to your configuration server. So again, once you come to servers and drill down, if I click on my configuration server, you'll see that I have a Fabricam WinMT, which is my master target server that's deployed and registered to my config server. Now, the final step, at least in your setup, if you go back to Quick Start, is deploying the process server. Now, remember that the process server is something that you deploy on premises or on your source data center, right? If it's an AWS VM that you're looking to migrate, you'll deploy the process server in your AWS account. And the best practice recommendation is that it should be on the same network or subnet, or at least be routable to your source servers that you're looking to migrate, right? If you're doing cross-region Azure migrations, you deploy the process server again on your source region where you have your VMs that you need to migrate. And the process server, you download and install the process server installation. Take a Windows Server 2012 R2 virtual machine or physical machine and run through the installer. It's a couple of clicks. And again, the final step there would be it'll ask you to register to the configuration server. And once you do, your deployment is pretty much ready, right? So the three components I showed you, configuration server, master target server, and process server, are now deployed. So if I go back to my servers tab, again drill down into my config server, you'll see that I have 3 process servers that I have installed and I've registered to this configuration server, because I'm going to show you a total of 3 demos. This first section we're showing, VMware and then, AWS. So I have, this is my on-premise process server, Fabricam-PS. This is my process server that's sitting in my AWS account. And this is my Azure process server for Azure migrations, right? So I'm using the same configuration server. Again, this is flexibility. You can use the same infrastructure and migrate stuff from different source environments. So let's click on this configure tab. This is where we're going to show you your choice of whether you're using VPN or non-VPN, right? So if you already have a VPN deployed, so the default, by the way, is doing it over the internet, right? So you don't need to have a VPN. I want to be clear about it. The solution works over the internet and is secure by default. We always, use encrypted channels for sending the data and for all control communication. The only thing is, if you're extremely security conscious, or you want to have an express route connection, because you want to have really good performance on your replication, you just come and flip this to VPN. What you'll notice as I flip this is all the communication, when it's a non-VPN, it's on public IP addresses because we have to route over the internet. But as soon as you switch to VPN, your active IP address and port for all your servers becomes your private IP address, right? So we're no longer going and communicating outside over the internet. We're talking over the site-to-site VPN to the private IP addresses. Now, you could have force tunneling. All of those scenarios work, right? So you could have an internet proxy that's sitting inside your on-premises environment, and you could force tunnel that. All that is supported. So this is a really seamless way for you to make an upfront decision on what is your deployment looking like. Are you going to deploy a VPN and do those migrations over it? If yes, then you come and flip the switch and save the settings. In our case, we're going to do it over the internet, so I'll leave it as non-VPN. So that's about it, right? You've deployed your config server, master target, process server, decided whether you're going to do VPN or not, and you've set up all of this, right? So the immediate next stage is to go and discover your vCenter or your ESX host and add the virtual machines to protection, right? So from a discovery perspective, let's add, so I come to my configuration server. I say add vCenter. I give it a friendly name. Give the username and password. And then select which process server I want to use for this discovery, right? So in my case, I'm using the Fabricam process server, which I have deployed and installed in my VMware environment on the same network. So I'm going to use that and say OK. So we fire off a job that goes and now discovers this vCenter using the IP address and port that we specified, and then registers that to this config server. Now I already have a vCenter that is discovered and sitting here, Fabricam-vCenter. This is the one that I showed you where all my SharePoint servers are being managed, right? So let's use that and start proceeding with enabling replication for our servers. So I'll go now to protected items. We have this concept called protection groups. What protection groups helps you do is define sort of a a plan for your group of VMs, right? So you may have, in my case, I'll show you, we have a SharePoint protection group where I can define things like I want app consistency across all my VMs, right? So n-tier consistency, ensuring that my database server, middle tier, and all other servers replicate consistently and fail over consistently, right? So Azure Site Recovery is one of the few technologies that allows you guaranteed, application recovery. It gives you capabilities like this multi-VM consistency capability that we are just talking about that ensures that you get your application up and running after your migration, not just a series of VMs, right? You can, of course, migrate VM by VM, but the scope generally, as we talk to customers, is customers are thinking of moving app by app, and so we provide these capabilities for you to be able to do that. So let's create a new protection group. We'll call it Ignite Demo PG. Again, my source is the Fabricam config server. Target is, of course, Azure. And when I click Next, you'll see some of these properties that I was just talking about. So one of them is multi-VM consistency. So if I decide that I'm going to put a group of servers that I want to replicate consistently and fail over consistently, then we select this option that says multi-VM consistency on. RPO threshold allows you to decide, what is your recovery point objective, right? If you want to be alerted if a particular RPO is missed, this allows you to set that value. So let's say we set it to 15 minutes. And then recovery point retention. This is primarily a disaster recovery concept, although it could be used for migrations too. You can decide that all the data that you're replicating to Azure, you'll save and retain for a certain number of hours, right? So we have, on the master target server, we reserve one drive, one of the VHDs, for retention. So this is what it's specifying. How many hours of retention do you want? Let's leave it at 24. And then the app consistent snapshot frequency. So as I talked about, you want your applications to be replicating consistently, so you decide what's the frequency at which you want the snapshots to be issued. And so in this case, we leave it at, say, 30 minutes, right? And then click OK. Now, this fires off a job and goes and creates the protection group. And now any VMs or physical servers that you add to this protection group are all going to replicate with these properties that you just defined. So if you see my other jobs, the add vCenter was finished, and this one will also finish in a couple of seconds. The vault was also created. Okay, so again, for those of you who have not seen Azure, from what I saw in terms of the show of hands, looks like a lot of you have. Here's our job pane where you can go and get detailed status for every job that you're executing. So for example, the add vCenter, configuring a protection group, all of the job status shows up here. So go to protected items. So here's my Ignite Demo PG that's created already. Now I drill down into it and say add machines. So here you see I have two options. I can add either virtual machines, which is what we're doing in this case, or I can add physical machines. Now, physical machines is a generalization. It can be true physical machines, bare metal servers. We'll use the same construct to replicate AWS VMs and Azure VMs, right? So we treat them as physical servers conceptually and use those to actually, replicate them. But in our case here, we're doing virtual machines. So I'll pick my vCenter. And you see here that we have discovered all the VMs that are sitting on that vCenter, and we're listing them out. We're also doing some pre-checks. Like, for example, given that we are a guest-based replication technology for the VMware and physical server migration solution, if you see that the VM is powered off, you can't select that. We obviously need the VMs to be running on the source for the replications to start. And then if, for example, an IP address is invalid, say your VMware tools are not installed, whatever the reason may be, we don't allow you to pick that server too. But in this case, there is a server that is ready. Now, the other thing that you see in this UI is the mobility service, right? Few of the servers, it says not installed. This particular server I was testing before the demo, so that is already installed. So what happens is, if we detect that the mobility service is not already installed on your source server, as part of this workflow, we're going to attempt to push the mobility service to your source server before enabling replication, right? So you'll see that coming up. So in this particular case, we already installed it. I picked the process server that I'm going to use. I picked the master target server that I want to replicate data to. And then I pick my storage account, right? So this is where all my replicated data is going to go and sit. This is my Azure storage account, right? So I go and select these, click next, and then if I had to, specify, if I wanted to push install, where for the cases where there is no push installation already done or the agent is not already installed, I go and say give my credentials and allow it to push the agent, right? So that's pretty much it. You've set up a single server to now be replicated. What is going to happen behind the scenes is we're going to check if the agent is there, the mobility service. If it's not there, we're going to go push the mobility service first to the source server, and then we're going to create a VHD on the target depending on the number of volumes or drives that you have on the source server, that many VHDs, and start replicating those to the master target server VHDs. So of course, depending on the size of your server, this initial replication could take a few minutes to a few hours. In our case here, I've already created a SharePoint protection group with the 4 servers that comprise my SharePoint site. So you'll see here that I have the Active Directory server, the SQL server, the app tier, and the web tier. All of them have finished protection. Their status says protected OK. And here's the RPO that you can see and monitor based on what the real-time RPO is, right? So now, of course, from here, you can individually fail over any of the VMs you want to. But in this case, we are looking at an entire app failover. So we'll talk about the next construct, which is called a recovery plan, or in our case here, it's a migration plan, right? So migration plan is a pretty powerful concept. It lets you actually define the entire app's migration paradigm, right? So it does 3 things. One is it allows you to do dependency modeling. So for example, in our case here, I have a Fabricam SharePoint recovery plan. I click it, and you'll see that I have many different groups defined, group 1, group 2, group 3, and group 4. And what this grouping construct lets us do is define the dependencies, right? We want the Active Directory to come up first, followed by the database, followed by the app tier, and followed by the web tier, right? So this is the sequence in which the actual migration will be kicked off, whether you do a test or you do an actual migration. And then there are 2 other constructs. The one here you see is the ability to add scripts, right? So we rely on Azure Automation, which is another Azure service, to allow you to add scripts that are essential for your application to come up. So in my case, for example, I have a script that helps enable port 80 on my web tier. But there are many other scripts. We actually have a bunch of samples up on Script Center, Azure Script Center, that help you do things for common application use cases. And then finally, you'll see that we also have, for things that cannot be scripted, we have the ability to add a manual action, right? So what is a manual action? It tells the migration admin that, hey, if you want to go check something off, let's say, for example, go test if the website is up, he can go and test the website is up, come back here, and say that I'm completing my manual action, and the recovery will, or the migration will proceed, right? So again, recap, 3 things, the ability to start off, and define the order in which you want your migration to be done across your various VMs, the ability to use scripts, and the ability to specify manual actions. One final point on the recovery plan is that if I were to put a couple of servers together, say, for example, in group 1, I had 2 or 3 servers together. Let's say I had a load-balanced, web tier, for example, here in group 4. Then both of those would be started off parallelly during the migration plan. So there's parallelism and sequencing depending on how you want to define your migration plan. So from a failover perspective, once I have this defined, all I need to do is say failover, which in our case is doing a migration to Azure. I can choose latest recovery point in time or latest app consistent recovery point in time, right? So if I have a group of servers that are related, like in this case where I have SharePoint Farm, then I'll say latest app consistent recovery point in time. and then click OK, and that kicks off the migration. It's going to take whatever the amount of time that is needed to start firing up the virtual machines in Azure, bringing them up one by one, running your scripts as you have defined it, waiting for manual actions, if any, and that finally showing the VMs start up in Azure, right? So, of course, it's going to take, this is a large enough setup, it's going to take more than 30 minutes to complete this recovery. So what I have is, I have a previous failed over instance. So if you see here, I'm now in my virtual machines in Azure in my same account, and you see that I have the same VMs here that are running, AD, SharePoint, Web, and SQL. So let me just RDP into my web tier VM. So once your migration is done, you have these servers that are that show up running inside your Azure IaaS subscription, you can then connect up to them, remote desktop, or you can have your app admin go and test it. However, let's say in this particular case, if you're looking at a SharePoint farm, you can have your app admin connect up to the right URL and do some testing there. All right, this demo Wi-Fi is fairly slow. This will come up, and then I'll show you what I'm talking about. Meanwhile, while this is coming up, let's actually switch gears. So that's basically taking a VMware set of applications, in our case a SharePoint farm, being able to replicate it to Azure, discover all the resources, replicate it to Azure, and actually migrate over, right? So let me start this up once again, right? So this is now I'm inside my web tier VM. You see that we have a cloudapp.net endpoint. So this is the cloud service that it's running in. If I open up my browser and say HTTP localhost, you'll see that the SharePoint site is now running in Azure. The same URL, the scripts are taking care of whatever they need to. And you now have your entire SharePoint portal that was running on VMware on premises now running in Azure inside your Azure subscription. All right, so that concludes the VMware to Azure migration demonstration. Let's switch over now quickly. I'm going to show this fairly quickly because the concepts are all similar, to the AWS to Azure part. So this is my AWS subscription. As you can see here, I have one VM, my AWS instance, and I've also deployed a process server on the same VNet, on the same network, so that it can talk to this VM. So that's this here. So I look at all my settings, and pretty much since they are at the same network, I can use the private IP to actually manually discover this AWS VM, protect it. Again, the same concept, create a protection group and add a virtual machine into it. There's no real automated discovery. It's VM by VM addition into the protection group, right? So if I switch back to the Azure portal and go to protected items, you'll see that I have my AWS group already defined here. I've added this single VM into the AWS group. And what I'll do right now is issue a migration for this single VM, right? So by the time I hand it off to Nathan and we come back for the next demonstration, we'd have this virtual machine failed over and running in Azure. So my AWS instance is right here. I'll say failover. And then again, I can choose whether I want to fail over to latest. In this case, it's just a single VM. I'm not doing a set of VMs in a recovery plan. So I'm going to say OK, and with that single click, start my migration, right? So now we're going and firing up the VM in Azure, going to kick that off, and we'll see when the job completes, you'll see the VM actually running in Azure. All right, with that, I'm going to hand back to Nathan to start talking about Azure to Azure cross-region migration and other topics.
Thanks, Gaurav.
Thank you, Nathan.
Oh, what?
Okay, we switch it to 4.
What's one? 4?
Yeah, there you go.
Some reaction.
All right. So let me do a wrap. So summary is, these are the sort of 8 standard steps that you need to know. Create vault, quick start, follow the steps that you see. Set up your servers, config server, master target, process server. Register the vCenter server. Or in the case of physical machines or AWS VMs or Azure VMs, you just add those VMs into the protection group. You don't have to do any registration or discovery. Then protect the virtual machines, define your migration plan, and then test or migrate to Azure, right? So this is the same 8 steps you're going to see, for any source environment that we're going to talk about. From a requirement perspective, here's sort of, minimum configuration that we recommend on premises. Of course, you need sufficient bandwidth to replicate to Azure, and there's no inbound ports needed. Configuration server and master target server, you need an Azure subscription with sufficient resources. You need at least one standard A3 config server. Now, we don't ask you for the size for the config server because this is the only size we support. We've done our performance and scale testing, and this scales up to around 750 protected volumes. So it's a fairly large number, so you can use one configuration server for bunch of server migrations. And then one or more standard 4 VMs is what we recommend for the master target server. We give you an option to choose a standard D14 only if you need to have a single large server that has more than 15 disks total migrated, right? So an A4 supports up to 15 disks. If you want to go more than that, you can deploy a D14. Now, of course, from a scale-out perspective, we recommend that you keep deploying multiple A4s, right? Unless you have a need to have a single server protected which has more than 15 disks, we don't think you need a D14. And as we discussed during the demo, one of the drives in each of these master target servers is used for retention. That's reserved for any time you want to go back in time and pick an older copy. Hyper-V to Azure, this is again generally available. It's very, very straightforward. You don't need any of the components that we talked about. In this particular case, because you have Hyper-V Replica, which is built into Windows Server. So all you need to do is deploy the Microsoft Azure Recovery Services agent onto your Hyper-V hosts. Now note the difference. For Hyper-V, we're doing host-based replication. For VMware and other environments, we're doing guest-based replication. So once you do that, you're pretty much all set. From an actions perspective, I'm not doing a demo for this. The concepts are the same. Only difference you'll see is in step 3 and 4, you're basically, instead of registering a vCenter server, you're going to register a Hyper-V server, right? Everything else remains the same. And from a pricing standpoint, quick note. So migrations are essentially free, right? We're not charging. Today in the preview, any case, we're not charging anything. The preview is free. But once the service is generally available, even then, for the first 31 days of every VM, we're saying you don't really have to, there's no metering, there's no charge. And again, this is the first time we're announcing this as a, at a public event, where whether you're doing, again, while the goal is, for migrations, we also hear from our DR customers that at the time of POCs, proof of concepts, they'd like to have, a certain grace period to be able to do, their proof of concepts. So the same thing applies for DR too. No additional cost, if you finish your migration in 31 days. And again, note that it's every protected VM, right? So it's not 31 days since you create your vault. Every time you bring a new app, you get 31 days, right? And then after those 31 days, standard ASR pricing applies, right? So, we have links at the end of the deck that talk about what is the standard ASR pricing. But for the first 31 days or a month approximately, you're pretty much, you got free migrations. With that, I'm really going to hand off to Nathan now, and he's going to talk about Azure to Azure.
So Azure to Azure migration, this slide, I think, really reflects the best why it's a emerging scenario and why it's important. So these reflect the 19 regions that Azure has today. The ones in green are the Azure regions that we added last year alone. So Azure is definitely committed to a global presence for its services. One thing you'll notice is the yellow boxes for India. We are in the process of launching 3 India regions, Central, West, and South. We have not announced a GA date for when the capacity will be live. We do expect a private preview program at some time this year. If you're interested, come find me down at the Microsoft booths and we could talk about it. So we launched a lot of regions last year. We're able to talk about 3 that we're getting ready to, and we're not done yet. So what happens when we bring these new regions online is customers that were previously running their services, and a great example is Japan. Japan, we launched Japan West and Japan East in March 2014. Previously, Azure customers were running, the closest regions to them were Singapore and Hong Kong. So we brought these new regions, new customers, great. They take their applications, they deploy to them. What do we do about the applications and services that are still in Hong Kong and Singapore? So that's, in a nutshell, really what Azure to Azure is about. So it is a newer scenario that we are noticing as Azure goes and is aggressive about making regional availability of Azure data centers. And it's one that we are going to want to get in front of because customers are telling us that they want to move their apps for various reasons. And I had the opportunity to talk to some customers from Japan last month. And a typical example I talked to from one customer was they have 15 Linux VMs. They've been a long-time Azure customer for like a year and a half. Their VMs are running out of Singapore. The Linux VMs basically host a website and have some research publications on them, so kind of a basic usage. The problem is the website's all for customers that are in Japan, so every one of their customers has to come over the WAN and access Singapore. It makes their performance lousy, and it increases their costs. They're a typical customer that they just want to take their VMs from Hong Kong or Singapore and move them over into Japan. And that's a scenario that is a little bit new to us. The reason I got hired in Azure is to basically figure out what our tooling strategy and our documentation is for how we recommend that customers solve this. So you'll notice when I go through some of the scenarios that the tooling is a little bit different and possibly incomplete in some areas. And in the roadmap section of the talk, we'll talk about what we want to do to improve it. So there's kind of 2 aspects to Azure. What we have today, which is a little bit piecemeal, and where we want to be both this year and longer term. So there's kind of 2 sub-scenarios. There's subscription migration, which I'm not going to spend too much time on. That's kind of self-explanatory. I have a subscription with a bunch of services in it, and I want to be able to move it for some reason, maybe billing purposes or something else. The target subscription can either be in the same region or it could be in a different region. The interesting one is the region-to-region migration. So this is where customers want to run their existing Azure applications and services in a new region for performance, cost, or data residency purposes. I was talking about the customer that wanted to move to Japan East for performance and cost, but data residency is certainly a hot topic. Some customers are feeling a little awkward that their services may be running in a region where they don't trust the sovereign government or the tax laws are not advantageous to them. So this is starting to be a really hot topic for customers, and we are absolutely going to be evolving our platform to be able to meet this because, hey, we spent all this money to build a new data center, a new region. We want our loyal customers that have been with us for a while to be able to take advantage if that region offers better performance and cost for them. So under the umbrella of region to region, what is migration versus high availability versus load balancing? Because you can argue if I'm an application that has a global presence because I've got customers all around the world, is that at region to region? Well, not really, because there are cloud application architectures that deal with how do you have a widely global distributed application and be able to service customers that are in local region. I kind of define migration as something where generally you want to move to a target and then deprecate or decom the source after a while. So there's kind of this point in time or a start and end to the migration. So I don't see region to region in talking about migration really as important for load balancing or high availability. It's really about shifting. Really, customers think about shifting applications. We're not there yet in terms of our tooling or able to talk about that. We are primarily there around being able to talk about shifting services, which the next couple slides we'll go into. Some gotchas or kind of pain or friction points in our platform is when you migrate from one region to another, you're really creating a new set of storage accounts or basically new endpoints for the target of your that your source you're going to copy data over to. This means that your endpoints or URLs are going to be different, and so you might have to change some application code or update scripts. We don't have the ability yet in Azure to be able to rename a storage account so that you really have this kind of like, I just want to clone. I just take what's there in this region and make it available over there. And maybe even just make it like you push one button. That's kind of the North Star experience. We're not there yet. And the endpoints is a prime example of that. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the roadmap section in futures. Storage account keys, those are different between storage accounts. You can't clone them. So if you have an app that uses the primary keys to access a storage account, you're going to have to update that application when you create the new storage accounts in the target region. I used to own the time service in Windows a long time ago, so time zones are kind of near and dear to my heart. It's one that you'd be surprised how often it bites people, but when you move from region to region, you have to think about time zone, or rather, the best practice is to not have to think about time zone and use GMT. I mean, nobody ever suspects time issues until they start seeing, rollbacks or their transactions failing, or you just think about the financial sector if you've got a database that processes financial transactions. So definitely there. And DNS, which I also used to own in Active Directory, but I guess I used to own 2 services on this problem list. But DNS is something that you have to think about on when you do region to region. How are you configuring your DNS to point to the new IP addresses? And there's certain aspects to consider, like your time to live for the DNS records, so you can actually do failover. And I'll talk about that one in a little bit. So let's start with the first scenario. Storage. So let's say you've got a bunch of storage, you've got a bunch of blobs, tables, and files in a region, and you want to move it. This is thankfully the easiest scenario to talk about and also the most common. You've got a couple different options on how you can move that from one region to another. But all options start with step 1, which is you have to create the new storage account. And that's illustrated by showing my storage account 2. Option 1 is using AZ copy. AZ copy has kind of really come a long way in the recent last couple months, and you're starting to see features in it like concurrent thread processing to be able to do batch processing, recursive walking of directories, snapshot, the ability to only copy data that's different, so you can run it like recursively or reoccurring, and it only will copy it over. But it's only available on Windows, and you get it with the SDK. Option 2 is copy to a intermediary, and this is the one that kind of personally bothers me because I know so many customers do it, and it's really like I own both the left and the right. I'm Azure, and the fact that you have to ever go from an Azure region to on-premise to do something and just move it up into another Azure region is one that I really want to stamp out and eliminate down the line. But it is something that customers can do. Maybe there's an advantage for WAN. Maybe you want to do something like compression or encryption before you move it to the target. There could be reasons for that. And I couldn't talk about this without talking about storage migration without a nod to Python and Linux if you're not running Windows. There are blob commands for Python that you can have in Linux or even Apple if that's your thing. Unfortunately, from what I can tell, the blob operations are really, there's download and there's upload. So you have to go through an intermediary if you want to have a pure Python type-based system to move blobs from one region to another. And I'm a Python fan, so I might want to look into this, seeing how we can do something that's more like AZ copy, which allows the background asynchronous copy between 2 regions without having to go through your local network. Next is virtual machines. So virtual machines in Azure, I'm sure you're all aware, are actually a set of different services. You've got your VM compute. Maybe you have some virtual networking for like availability or something else, load balancer. And then because VM requires a storage account, that also may have, actually it does have file, blob, and table endpoints, which you could be using for data. So VM migration is really kind of this amalgamation of a couple different services. And so you want to keep those in mind when you do migration of a VM to another region. Option 1 for migrating is simply don't migrate. And this is, I'm not trying to be pedantic or insulting, but migration by its nature can be complex or involved. And this is basically don't migrate if you don't have to. If you have a bunch of pilot or pre-production servers that you just use for testing, you don't really care about them, then don't migrate, just recreate them, and if you have files that you need to copy, then copy. So if you don't have to migrate and you can still get the VMs in the new region, go with that option. Option 2 is this new one that we just announced today, and I can't say how hot off the press this is. This is literally something that we started supporting yesterday, which is the ability to use ASR for online migration from region to region. I'm really interested in folks trying this in this room and giving us feedback on whether or not you think this is the way we should go. So do we think about ASR and cross-region as an online VM migration scenario or something else? The reason why I say that is the next option is this tool, called the Azure Data Center Migration Solution. Show of hands, how many people here have heard this? Yeah, that's what I thought. That's depressing. This thing was expensive. Microsoft funded this tool. And I'll talk about it in a little bit. It's an open source tool through a company called Persistent Systems. Source code and binaries are on GitHub. If you want to go and check that out and contribute. I'll talk about in a second, the next slide, what it can and what it can't do. But basically, it supports moving virtual machines between two regions, but they must be offline. And then option 4 is, of course, go through an intermediary for some reason. I only added this one because I had breakfast with somebody who was saying that this was their preferred solution for VM migration for some reason with PowerShell or something else like that. But I want to get rid of that one long term. So the Azure Data Center Migration Solution. It's free, open source tool. It does VM migration. It also does some other services that might be interesting, like affinity groups, networks, which is definitely one that's to consider for moving VMs between regions around re-IPing, DNS, pointing to different IPs, all that. It does some cloud services, but you'll see down below it doesn't move web or worker roles. It can move storage. It moves storage accounts because that's required by the VM, but it doesn't. Well, I'll get to that in the limitations. And of course, it does virtual machines. So it supports 2 interesting scenarios that each have 2 permutations. The first one is moving from subscription to another subscription in either the same region or different regions, or in the same subscription with the same region or different region. So kind of flexible on what the source and target is. It basically has an export process where you point it out a region, and it will dump a bunch of information to a JSON file. And then you can use that to import into the target. The nice thing about this is it allows you to do offline editing if you want to tweak any of these, the JSON file for basically manually specifying some settings that you may want to do. But like I said, for limitations, it creates storage accounts on the target, but it excludes VM-independent blobs. So it's not usable if you have just a pure storage migration scenario. And also migration occurs offline, so the VMs have to be powered down. And web roles and worker roles are not migrated. So last thing I want to talk about on this, though, is I would love to talk after this session or this week sometime down in the booth on what your personal opinions or beliefs are on how we should invest in this tool versus ASR. Yes. It's just calling public REST. So the JSON file it produces an export a configuration that you can actually get with pretty simple PowerShell. It's not calling anything that's proprietary or anything. In fact, to learn what it was doing, I wrote a PowerShell script that just invoked the REST method that this is calling, and it allows you to dump out all your cloud services. So, yes? Yes. So the question is, what happens, and I'm going to add on to the question a little bit, what about specialty clouds like China, which has very strict rules and regulations on how you can operate a public cloud offering, and it's got to be through a local company, in this case, the one you said, and does that mean region to region? It should be absolutely the same. Now, when we talk about sovereign clouds, like clouds we stand up for the U.S. government and stuff, we still want the experience to be the same. But one thing you can tell with this tooling that you've kind of seen is right now it's a little bit kind of spotty. There's tools that do, some things really well that others don't. Let me put it this way. I don't have this on the roadmap, but it is absolutely a goal that region-to-region migration is a consistent experience of tooling, regardless of what the source and target is. It should just work, but it's a good question. I haven't tried moving data into China. And so now we're going to go back to Gaurav, and he's going to do a demo on this just announced, hot off the press solution for using ASR to do region to region.
Thanks, Nathan. So we'll do a quick demo. We're running short of time, but essentially this is the same experience that you saw for VMware to Azure, physical to Azure, AWS to Azure. Now, here's sort of what we left off in the earlier portion of the demo. If you see our job log, the one VMware VM that we set off for protection is finalizing protection and nearly done. And then the AWS instance has failed over and is now running in Azure. So if I switch over to my VM view on Azure, you'll see my AWS instance that's running now in a cloud service in Azure. Now, for this demonstration, let's look at a couple of VMs that I have here. So I have the East Asia region. I have two VMs. So I have my LOB app and my Azure VM, and then I have a process server that I have deployed. You'll notice that all three of them are in the same cloud service. So essentially, they are on the same their same network, or they're routable, right? So that's in terms of the experience. If we go here. I'm not going to do a failover given we don't have much time, but at least to show you what you need to do, I'll say add physical machines, go into say one of these VMs, my LOB app, go to the dashboard, find its private internal IP, and then say give that here, give it a friendly name, and select the operating system type. Click Next. From here on, it's a familiar experience. You pick the Azure process server, pick the master target, pick the storage account. Click Next. If you don't have the mobility service installed, it'll use the credentials that you give here to go and install the mobility service, and you're done, right? So that's pretty much the experience. For failover, you click on the VM that's already protected, like here, and you can click failover, right? So that's it for Azure to Azure cross-region migrations. The target needs to be, the vault needs to be in the target that you want to, hold your, so in my case, I was on East Asia with the source. My vault is in Southeast Asia. My storage account is in Southeast Asia, so I'm moving those VMs from East Asia to Southeast Asia. Back to Nathan.
We're almost out of time here. If we don't have time during the session for questions, I really want to let everybody know that we'll be available down in the booth all week if you want to have follow-ups. So the last quick scenario I wanted to talk about is the Big Daddy scenario. I've got a born-in-cloud, native, multi-tier application, web roles, worker roles, SQL DBs, VMs, storage, you name it. And thankfully, I'm almost out of time because this is the one where we don't have much of a story for. Your options, this is a very complex type of migration scenario. and you either have enough expertise in-house to be able to figure out how to do this, like maybe you don't have to migrate your web or your worker roles, maybe you migrate, use the tools to do VM or storage, and you figure something out with SQL. Stay tuned on this one. This is one that we are going to be investing at least documentation in on how we recommend doing it. So it's either do it yourself or you pay somebody to do it for you, and this is like call us. So option 2 is call MCS or your favorite system integrator, have them put together a migration plan, because at this level, you're not thinking about services, individual services to move. You're thinking about things like maintenance windows, downtime, customer impact, and moving the application, and you don't care if one component made it across to the target region successfully. You want the whole app to work, and usually there's things like contract stipulations around that. So we've seen typically customers pay for this. The thing at the bottom is I took that from a MCS person who has a lot of experience moving these types of apps. I don't have enough time to go into detail about it, but this is kind of the anatomy of a native cloud multi-tier migration scenario and the different phases that you go through. But I'm going to skip that for time, and I want to talk about finally the roadmap. Where are we going with all of this? Okay, first, and this is kind of predictions and futures. More regions are on the way. We're not done with our regions. That's what I can say. So the ability to have flexibility and elasticity on moving Azure services between regions is really something that I have to nail through an approach of tools, guidance, all those types of things. Speaking of guidance, writing some documentation on how to do this would probably help some customers, and I want to get that out this year. Tooling. What do we do with tooling? Well, first for ASR, you saw that this year, right now, in fact, there's more sources and guest OS types supported, which I think is a good thing. It gives you more flexibility for whatever scenario you have. Next one is the consistent experience. So we've been talking as we kind of put this slide deck together on how different is on-premise to Azure from Azure to Azure. And there seems like there's a lot of overlap, but we have a very different approach and tool set. You've got for on-prem to Azure, I would say it's a mature scenario. It's littered with different companies that have provided solutions. We see this ASR demo with UI, and most of the stuff I was talking about for Azure to Azure are like scripts. So really, we want to kind of rationalize, is it really a different scenario? Do we use the same tool? Do we not? I'd love some feedback on that one. But I honestly think that a consistent experience is, even for across services, would be a good thing. Again, the North Star, I push a button and everything just moves. Like, it's really easy to imagine where we want to go, which is you've got the Azure portal, you've got that native multi-tier cloud, and there's just a checkbox that says, hey, make this available in my other region, and boom. But we're not there yet, and we won't be for a while, but that's kind of the North Star experience. Migration as a service, and so this is the ability to have migration offered as a first-class citizen up in Azure portal, and all the logging, all the management, everything else is all done in the cloud. So you don't need to run binaries on your local machine on premise to be able to kind of manage all the moving pieces here. And then there's work we have to do in our platform to remove some of the pain points and friction by evangelizing cross-region migration as a first-class citizen by looking at whether or not we can do things like cloning or copying storage without having to change your application, which is kind of a messy scenario. So that's kind of where our head is at right now on migration. And I'm really, I need your feedback on what we're missing. I didn't have enough room on the slide to talk about third party. Like we have this, Python. How does that play into all of this? So any input you can provide us, it will help guide our investment strategy on what we do in the coming year and years on supporting this scenario. So with that, I'd like to thank you for postponing your dinner while we talk about all things migration. If there's any questions or comments, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll leave this slide up. Strongly encourage you to sign up for the ASR preview and try things out. The links here, the slide deck will be available along with the recording, or you can stop by at the Azure Site Recovery booth and we'll give you all the details. There's more sessions coming up, so if you're interested in learning more about disaster recovery, here are the list of sessions that you can come and attend. Thank you very much for staying late. Thank you.